Police believe that this was some sort of personal dispute. In this shooting, one student is dead, another critically injured. The student who survived this shooting is currently in the hospital, said to be in stable condition. As for the suspect, he is not a student, according to authorities. Authorities arresting Jacob Lee Bard of Evansville, Indiana, charging him with murder and first-degree assault. This all happened Tuesday afternoon on campus near a dorm. All classes have been canceled for the rest of the week as the investigation is still ongoing. But again, police say there is no...
You just watched the unfolding of something so profoundly disturbing that it ought to ignite fury in every molecule of your being, because what we are witnessing in this clip is not merely a medical case or an ethical dilemma abstracted from reality. This is the logical and horrifying endpoint of a political movement that has spent decades constructing the infrastructure necessary to transform living, breathing women into vessels stripped of personhood, agency, and dignity. In May 2025, it was reported that 30-year-old Adriana Smith, who had suffered a medical emergency and become brain dead when 9 weeks pregnant, was being kept on life support by Emory University Hospital, who cited Georgia's abortion ban as the reason for keeping her on life support, a development that should detonate every alarm bell we possess about the nightmarish reality unfolding in post-Roe America, where the cruel logic of fetal personhood collides catastrophically with the fundamental right to bodily autonomy and the right to die with dignity. What you need to understand immediately, what should be searing itself into your consciousness right now, is that abortion in Georgia is illegal after detection of embryonic cardiac cell activity, which typically begins in the 5th or 6th week after the onset of the last menstrual period, meaning this is one of the most restrictive abortion regimes in the nation. And although this law was ruled unconstitutional by a Georgia Superior Court judge on September 30, 2024, it remains in effect while the state appeals the ruling, which tells you everything you need to know about how relentlessly the machinery of forced birth grinds forward, even when courts recognize its constitutional bankruptcy. The family claims the hospital told them legally she had to be kept on life support to allow the fetus to grow. And just pause for one excruciating moment to contemplate what that sentence actually means, to sit with the grotesque reality that a woman declared legally dead, a human being whose life has ended, whose personhood has been extinguished, is being maintained as a biological incubator, because the state of Georgia and its draconian abortion laws have decided that the potential for a 9-week fetus to develop supersedes every conceivable consideration of human dignity, family autonomy, and medical ethics. The clip you just witnessed lays bare the dehumanization in stark, clinical language. The option was that there's a law in place, and they have to follow the guidelines of the law. The family was told, which is bureaucratic evasion that masks the monstrous reality that this family was robbed of choice, stripped of the ability to make decisions about their loved one's body, denied the opportunity to let Adriana Smith rest because in Georgia, a D&C abortion is a felony, unless it is performed under certain circumstances, and a doctor can face up to 10 years in jail for performing it, while the Georgia law HB 481 does not specifically name D&C procedures as illegal, but generalizes to include procedures that stop the heartbeat of a fetus. Notice the insidious architecture here, the way these laws create zones of terror for medical professionals where the threat of felony prosecution and a decade in prison looms over every clinical decision, transforming what should be compassionate end-of-life care into a legal minefield where hospitals choose the path of least liability rather than the path of greatest humanity. And here's where this becomes even more enraging, where the contradictions and the cruelty converge into something that should mobilize mass resistance. Georgia Attorney General Chris Carr, a Republican, said that the law should not restrict the options for care in a case like Smith's, and that removing life support wouldn't be equivalent to aborting a fetus, stating, "There is nothing in the Life Act that requires medical professionals to keep a woman on life support after brain death." Yet Republican State Senator Ed Setzler, who authored the Life Act, disagreed, telling the Associated Press that Emory's doctors acted appropriately when they put Smith on life support, saying, "I think it is completely appropriate that the hospital do what they can to save the life of the child, and I think this is an unusual circumstance, but I think it highlights the value of innocent human life." Do you see the gaslighting here? The absolutely maddening doublespeak where the state's own attorney general claims the law doesn't require this barbaric treatment, while the architect of the law himself celebrates it as appropriate, leaving families and medical providers trapped in a labyrinth of contradictory legal opinions where nobody knows what the law actually permits, but everyone understands that the safest bet is to treat women's bodies as state property. The clip describes this as extremely unprecedented to have a mom who is brain dead sustained on life support starting from the first trimester, and the bioethicist calls it disturbing, noting that the biggest and most startling and disturbing fact is this one was 9 weeks. That baby's going to be inside a dead body for a very long time. Language that cannot possibly capture the full moral horror of what is happening here, because we are talking about using a deceased woman's corpse as a biological support system for fetal development against the explicit wishes of her family. Although doctors were hoping to keep Smith alive up until 32 weeks gestation, an emergency C-section was performed at 25 weeks gestation, which means this woman's body was maintained on machines for approximately 4 months, kept breathing artificially, heart pumping through technological intervention, organs functioning through medical support, all while her family watched in anguish as doctors told the family that Smith's baby had a buildup of fluid in the brain, and there were concerns of health issues including a risk of blindness or not being able to walk, with her mother saying, "This decision should have been left to us. Now we're left wondering what kind of life he'll have, and we're going to be the ones raising him." This is the necropolitics of forced birth laid bare, the literal conscription of dead women's bodies into reproductive servitude, and if that phrase sounds extreme to you, then you have not been paying sufficient attention to the implications of fetal personhood laws that confer personhood on a fetus in Georgia, laws that fundamentally alter the legal landscape by granting fetuses the same legal rights and status given to born people, which fundamentally changes the legal rights and status of all pregnant people, opening the door to criminalization, surveillance, and obstetric violence. Currently, 17 states have established fetal rights by law or judicial decision to apply to criminal law or both criminal and civil laws, constructing a vast architecture of control that extends far beyond abortion access into domains of bodily autonomy, medical treatment, end-of-life care, and reproductive freedom that most Americans cannot yet comprehend, because the full implications are still unfolding in real time, with devastating human consequences. Let me make the connections explicit because this case is not an aberration. This is the system working exactly as designed. Since the 1990s, many states have passed legislation, enabled by the idea of fetal personhood, that prevents women in comas or vegetative states from being removed from life support if they are pregnant, and these laws are enforced without regard to what stage of development the fetus is in, what the woman's end-of-life preferences were, or whether or not the woman is experiencing pain as a result of remaining alive, which constitutes depriving women of end-of-life autonomy as an extreme and disturbing violation of their privacy rights. This legal framework existed before Dobbs, before the 2022 Supreme Court decision that obliterated the constitutional right to abortion, but the fall of Roe has supercharged these laws, emboldening states to push ever further into the subjugation of women's bodily autonomy. The case has captured national attention and raised numerous legal and ethical questions about medical consent and who should get to make decisions for permanently incapacitated people, especially when pregnant, with Georgetown law professor Michaela Goodwin calling it a case that reflects the confusion in the post-Dobbs era, because the hospital believed that it could not allow this brain-dead woman to simply be deceased because the state has a very strict abortion law. And here is where we need to zoom out and understand the systematic nature of the violence being perpetrated against pregnant people in states that have enacted abortion bans, because the data is absolutely damning. Mothers living in states that banned abortion are nearly 2x as likely to die during pregnancy, childbirth, or soon after giving birth, compared to mothers living in supportive states where abortion was legal and accessible, while maternal mortality fell 21% in supportive states post-Dobbs, which means we can draw a direct causal line between abortion restrictions and maternal death, between the political decision to ban reproductive health care and the bodies piling up as a result. In the first full year of Texas's state abortion ban, 2022, maternal mortality increased significantly, with the maternal mortality rate rising 56%, up 95% among white mothers, while maternal mortality overall increased just 11% in the United States. Numbers so stark they should be treated as a public health emergency, as evidence of state-sanctioned violence against pregnant people. The racial dimensions of this catastrophe cannot be ignored because Black mothers living in banned states were 3.3x as likely to die as white mothers in those states, and on August 19, 2022, 28-year-old Amber Thurman of suburban Atlanta died of septic shock due to complications from a chemical abortion, with a maternal mortality review committee concluding that Thurman's death was preventable, one of multiple documented cases of women who have died because abortion bans prevented timely medical care, transforming pregnancy complications into death sentences. Pregnancy Justice documented nearly 1,400 instances of pregnant women being charged, often for substance use, in the 16 years leading up to the June 2022 Dobbs decision, with most cases occurring in a handful of southern states including Alabama, South Carolina, and Tennessee, that have expanded their definitions of child abuse to include fetuses, fertilized eggs, and embryos, and nearly 85% of pregnancy criminalization cases involved charges against a pregnant person who was legally indigent, with the laws disproportionately applied to poor women and women of color. This is the reproductive subjugation of marginalized populations, the weaponization of the criminal legal system against those who lack the resources to flee to states with abortion access, the construction of a two-tiered system where wealthy women can always obtain the health care they need, while poor women, immigrant women, are trapped and terrorized. Researchers estimate 22,180 more live births and 478 more infant deaths than expected across 14 states, including Texas, that banned abortion between September 2021 and August 2022, and I want you to sit with those numbers, with the knowledge that 478 infants died who would not have died absent these bans, babies who were born into circumstances where they could not survive, where severe fetal abnormalities meant brief lives of suffering, where deaths from congenital malformations and birth defects rose nearly 11%, suggesting that bans prevented termination of pregnancies with severe fetal abnormalities meant brief lives of suffering. The cruelty is the point, forcing pregnancies to term regardless of fetal viability, regardless of whether the child can survive, regardless of the anguish inflicted on families who wanted to make compassionate medical decisions but were prohibited by the state from doing so. And the healthcare system is collapsing under the weight of these laws because many state abortion laws have criminal penalties against medical providers, doctors, nurses, or hospitals that perform abortions, which leads to providers being overly cautious, and what were the gold standards of treatment have now been put to the sidelines, as there is just simply confusion and a sense that better to not provide services, better to keep a person on ventilation who's brain dead, than to act according to medical training and ethical training. Doctors are fleeing states with abortion bans, OBGYN residency programs in restrictive states are seeing plummeting applications, maternal healthcare deserts are expanding, and states with abortion bans or restrictions experience adverse outcomes, including limited maternity care providers, maternity care deserts, higher rates of maternal mortality and infant death, especially among people of color, and abortion-restrictive states have a 32% lower ratio of obstetricians to births and a 59% lower ratio of certified nurse midwives to births compared to states with abortion access. The infrastructure of maternal care is being systematically dismantled by laws that make it impossible for providers to practice evidence-based medicine, that expose them to felony prosecution for providing standard care, that force them to choose between their patients' lives and their own freedom. Now let's be absolutely clear about what fetal personhood actually means as a legal doctrine, because all pre-viability fetal personhood laws ban abortion and could have even broader implications for reproductive health care access and the potential criminalization of pregnancy, and personhood measures effectively replace the rights of a pregnant person with the rights of the zygote, embryo, or fetus, limiting essential health care for pregnant people and making their care subordinate to that of the zygote, embryo, or fetus. This is not hyperbole. This is the explicit legal structure being constructed where a fertilized egg, a clump of cells, a 9-week fetus, has rights that supersede the rights of the living, breathing, thinking, feeling woman carrying it. Where if a zygote or a fetus is a person, abortion might be legally considered murder, and the same goes for certain types of birth control, raising questions about whether IUD users could be convicted of manslaughter, since IUDs can prevent the implantation of a fertilized egg. The implications spiral outward into every aspect of reproductive life: contraception access, IVF treatments, miscarriage management, ectopic pregnancy care, cancer treatment during pregnancy. Every medical decision becomes a potential legal liability when the state has decided that fetal life supersedes maternal autonomy. And here's what should absolutely terrify you about the future trajectory of this movement. As of November 2025, 48% of all Project 2025 policies have been enacted or are in progress, with nearly 40% of the reproductive restrictions completed or underway. The Project 2025 document urges the next presidential administration to enforce the Comstock Act against the manufacturers and distributors of mifepristone, and a Trump DOJ may signal enforcement of the Comstock Act to prohibit distribution of abortion drugs via mail and common carriers, which would constitute a de facto national abortion ban even in states that have protected abortion rights through constitutional amendments. Federal officials could undermine state abortion rights using the Comstock Act, a 19th-century obscenity law that anti-abortion leaders have framed as a de facto ban on mailing any abortion-related drugs or paraphernalia, and the abortion provisions of Project 2025 focus on the Comstock Act, and because the Comstock Act is a federal law, it would likely preempt state-level protections for reproductive rights, including ballot initiatives. The legal architecture is being assembled right now to nationalize forced birth, regardless of what voters in individual states decide, to use federal law to override the will of the people who have repeatedly, consistently, overwhelmingly voted to protect abortion access when given the opportunity. The case of Adriana Smith is not an edge case, not an unforeseeable consequence, not an unfortunate side effect of well-intentioned laws. This is the entire point of the fetal personhood movement. In the British newspaper The Independent, journalist Zoe Beatty wrote that Smith's case was harrowing proof that the US is living in the Handmaid's Tale, urging vigilance in the United Kingdom. And while references to Margaret Atwood's dystopian novel have become almost cliché in discussions of reproductive rights, the comparison is not melodramatic when we are literally discussing the state's use of a dead woman's body as a fetal incubator, when we are watching in real time as the most intimate decisions about life, death, pregnancy, and bodily autonomy are stripped from individuals and families and handed to politicians and prosecutors and judges who view women primarily as vessels for reproduction. This family was told there's a law in place and they have to follow the guidelines of the law. Passive voice obscuring who made this law, who voted for this law, who celebrates this law as a victory for life, while Chance now weighs 11 pounds and will be moved to a different hospital for better help with his health problems, and coming into the world at about 25 weeks of gestation. He weighed just 1 pound, 13 ounces, and in a previous update, Newkirk said Chance's lungs are underdeveloped, so he'll be in the NICU until his breathing improves. A child born months premature with significant health challenges, a grandmother left to raise him while grieving her daughter, a family traumatized by watching their loved one's body used as an incubator against their wishes, and for what? For whose benefit? Who is served by this system of control and suffering? The conservative movement has spent half a century constructing the intellectual, legal, and political infrastructure to overturn Roe v. Wade, and they succeeded, and now we are seeing the rollout of the next phase, which is the total subordination of pregnant people to fetal life at every stage of development, the transformation of pregnancy into a condition that strips you of constitutional rights, bodily autonomy, medical privacy, and dignity. Goodwin said she believes the landscape in a post-Dobbs America means more cases like Smith's are likely to occur, and there will be confusion over what treatment to provide, noting that many state abortion laws have criminal penalties against medical providers, which leads to providers being overly cautious, and what were the gold standards of treatment have now been put to the sidelines. This is not hypothetical future harm. This is the present reality for millions of women living under abortion bans, living in states where pregnancy has become a legal hazard, where every miscarriage might trigger a criminal investigation, where every pregnancy complication might be denied treatment until you're sick enough to satisfy some prosecutor's interpretation of what constitutes a medical emergency. And we need to name what this is. We need to call it what it actually represents: the reassertion of patriarchal control over women's bodies through state violence, the rollback of decades of progress toward recognizing women as full legal persons with autonomy over their own reproductive lives, the construction of a two-tiered citizenship where pregnant people occupy a subordinate legal status to the fetuses they carry, the current direction of reversing women's reproductive autonomy while simultaneously cutting social benefit programs leaves women with no social, political, or economic support, and highlights the hypocrisy of controlling women's bodies while hanging them out to dry. Because let's be very clear, that the same politicians who demand that women continue pregnancies regardless of circumstance are the same politicians who vote against Medicaid expansion, against paid family leave, against child care subsidies, against any policy that would actually support children and families, revealing that this has never been about life and has always been about control. According to research, abortion restrictions have a detrimental cost on women's health and education, with restrictions costing the U.S. an average of $173 billion per year, and on an individual level, abortion restrictions lower the likelihood a woman will graduate from school, lower her overall lifetime earnings, and ultimately lead to poorer outcomes for her children, while in states where abortion is banned, women work more hours per week, have a lower income, become mothers earlier, and give birth to more children, and access to abortion is especially important for economically vulnerable groups, with denying abortion increasing poverty among individuals. The economic violence of forced birth, the theft of educational and employment opportunities, the intergenerational transmission of poverty and disadvantage, all of this is baked into the system, all of this is predictable and predicted, and the politicians enacting these laws know exactly what they are doing, they know exactly whose lives they are destroying, and they do it anyway because maintaining patriarchal control is more important than women's health, autonomy, education, economic well-being, or lives. The question that the clip raises, is it worth it to try and save a fetus to become a child in a dead woman, is the wrong question, or rather it's a question that obscures the real issue, because this was never about saving anyone. This was about asserting state control over women's bodies even after death. This was about establishing the precedent that pregnancy supersedes all other considerations, including the rights of the deceased and their families. This was about normalizing the most extreme implications of fetal personhood, so that the lesser violations feel reasonable by comparison. If we accept that a brain-dead woman can be maintained as a fetal incubator for months against her family's wishes, then surely we can accept that a living woman should be forced to continue an unwanted pregnancy. Surely we can accept that doctors should have to wait until a woman is septic or hemorrhaging before providing care. Surely we can accept the gradual erosion of bodily autonomy until nothing remains but the state's power to control reproduction by any means necessary. And this is where the resistance must focus. This is where we need to channel rage into action, because many states enacted policies to expand access to sexual and reproductive health services, including state constitutional protections for abortion that passed by ballot initiative in 7 states, and for the most part ballot measures voted in support of abortion rights, which means the political will exists to protect reproductive freedom even in conservative states, which means there is a path forward that involves state-level constitutional amendments, litigation challenging these laws under state constitutions, building political power to elect legislators and governors who will repeal abortion bans, protecting and expanding abortion funds and practical support organizations, defending medical providers from prosecution, documenting and publicizing every preventable death and every family tragedy caused by these laws until the human cost becomes impossible to ignore. The conservative movement is betting that Americans will accept this new normal, that we will become desensitized to stories like Adriana Smith's, that the horror will fade into background noise, but we cannot allow that to happen because the Georgia Maternal Mortality Review Committee concluded in 2024 that the deaths of 2 pregnant mothers were preventable and that they were unable to receive the appropriate health care due to the state's abortion ban, and preliminary findings indicate an 8% increase in pregnancy-associated mortality, equivalent to 59 excess deaths, and while the relative increase was similar across all racial groups, the absolute impact was greater for Black women, who already faced higher baseline mortality rates. These are not statistics. These are human beings with names and families and futures that were stolen from them by laws that prioritize ideological commitments to fetal life over the actual lives of living, breathing women. The clip you watched is evidence of a crime, documentary proof of the state's violence against women's bodies and autonomy, and it should be used as such, weaponized politically to expose the monstrous reality of post-Roe America, to force voters to confront what they have enabled through their support of anti-abortion politicians, to mobilize the majority who support abortion rights to translate that support into political power sufficient to dismantle this apparatus of control and suffering. Because Adriana Smith deserved better. Her family deserved the right to let her rest with dignity. Her son deserved to be born into circumstances chosen by his family rather than mandated by the state, and the thousands of women who will face similar nightmares in the coming years deserve a healthcare system that prioritizes their lives and autonomy over the ideological commitments of politicians who will never face the consequences of the laws they pass. This is the fight. This is where the line must be drawn. This is the moment where we either accept the systematic subjugation of pregnant people, or we resist with every tool at our disposal, because the alternative is a future where women's bodies become property of the state, where pregnancy means the suspension of constitutional rights, where families watch helplessly as their loved ones are used as incubators against their will, and where the promise of equality and autonomy that animated the women's liberation movement is systematically dismantled by reactionary forces that never accepted women as full human beings in the first place. The horror you just witnessed is the system working as designed, and only mass political mobilization can tear that system down and build something better in its place.